Today's presentation is entitled Lawyer Hero. We all have heroes. We all need heroes. Heroes are an important part of our lives, whether we think so or not. Many times the acquisition of a hero comes from hearing a story. And today I want to tell you a story about one of my heroes. I think the art of storytelling is important to maintain and to foster. Not storytelling about fictional stories, but storytelling about real events, and true heroes. The story I want to tell you today is about a lawyer, a man, a statesman, a great lawyer, a great man, a great statesman. This is a man who constantly faced adversity through various stages of his life, even in the final years. A man who at each time he faced adversity, he would step up, figure out how to conquer the adversity and rise to a newer level. Many times he was alone as he faced his adversity. One of the problems this lawyer had was alcoholism, and it caused lots of problems in his life. Adversity that he had to overcome. That's part of his story. Why do I take the time to go through the story and tell you about this? I don't know. I'm really drawn by his story. And I suppose, since he's my hero, that part of me would like to see you adopt him as your hero too. I did not know the man, but I had the wonderful opportunity to know his great-great-grandson. His great-great-grandson was Professor Robert J. Hogan, and he was a colleague of mine at South Texas College of Law in Houston. He's a law professor, he died unfortunately in 1993. He taught Property 1, Property 2, wills, and domestic relations. He died after I left the school, but I was a colleague of his from 1985 to 1990. We frequently talked about many things, Professor Hogan and I. Took a liking to him. He told me many things about his great-great-grandfather, and I pressed because I wanted to learn more. Some of the things he talked about was his alcoholism and how he would finally have to figure out how to live his life free from alcohol. And I think he probably talked about that a little bit more than he normally did. He probably thought I needed to hear that. I don't know. Whatever. Where do I get the information for these remarks? A whole lot of this information comes from Professor Hogan, his account to me. He planted a seed of interest that turned into intense enthusiasm on my part, and I've done much to learn all I can possibly learn about this lawyer. A lot of my information comes from research, a whole lot of research, and a whole lot of research in recent years because my enthusiasm has accelerated. Everything that he told me has been verified, and in these remarks today I've tried to verify everything that I have to say from at least one source. I also have to say I've benefited greatly from the inspiration, patience, and encouragement from a lady in San Antonio, Texas. Her name is Madge Roberts. Madge is a distant cousin to my friend Bob Hogan, and she is frequently called upon to speak about this hero, her great-great-grandfather. She unselfishly provided me with a copy of her remarks, or a copy of her paper entitled The Road to San Jacinto, a paper which is heavily documented, heavily footnoted. Madge is called upon to speak across the country about her great-great-grandfather and has spoken about him many times. She also has reviewed numerous letters he's written. The accounts are there are more than 1,000 letters that he had written during his lifetime, and she's had the opportunity to look at those. They didn't have television and computers when he was around, so if you were articulate, you tended to write letters. He had written lots of letters, and that's helped us understand the situation. Also, Madge has graciously reviewed for me 2 earlier drafts of these remarks, as I've been working on them for a couple weeks now for this day. So I'm greatly indebted to Madge for her patience with me, and I assure you if there are any mistakes in what I say today, they're completely mine, not hers. I take sole credit for that. If I stick to what I have here, I'll be okay. It's when I wander that I get in trouble. Now the trick is that I'm going to talk about this person and not tell you his name until toward the very end. Some of you may know who he is, and if so, don't tell everybody. When we get to that point, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand and let me know if you know who this person is. Some of you might, and some of you I wouldn't have. So if you don't feel bad, because I wouldn't have until a few years ago. Also, we have Mark Derby here, audio-visual department of CIDD. He's videotaping, and after the class, if some of you would like to make comments, I think it would be very beneficial for this videotape if you could make your, not anything elaborate, 5 or 10 seconds at most. Talk about whether or not you heard something new, you knew the story, something like that. Remember what my mother said also, if you please. This lawyer was born in 1793. His father fought in the Revolutionary War in Morgan's Rifle Brigade. He was born in Shenandoah Valley. He was given the exact same name as his father. He was the 5th of 9 children. When he was 12 years old, his father died unexpectedly, and his mother took all of the children and moved to Tennessee. He grew up in Tennessee. He received a decent education until about age 15. He got frustrated at home and ran away. He had a single parent, lots of kids, not happy. He ended up traveling to a band of Cherokee Indians and lived with the Cherokee Indians for a period of 3 years. He had an Indian chief, I've been practicing my Cherokee here, Olutika, who adopted him. And he was given an Indian name, the name for Raven, Cherokee name of Colonna. He did go back and visit he was on good terms with his mother, but he was raised by the Cherokee from age 15 on. He came back after the 3 or 4 years. At age 20, he enlisted in the Army of the United States. First was private, rose to ensign, and then quickly to 3rd lieutenant. He fought in the War of 1812 under General Andrew Jackson. The War of 1812 was lodged against the Creek Indians. It extended for several years. He was involved in a battle in present-day Alabama known as the Horseshoe Bend Engagement, very intense engagement where the two forces had squared off. He was very brave in fighting. He suffered injuries in that engagement. He suffered an arrow wound to his upper leg, also was shot, received bullet wounds in his upper arm and shoulder. The injury to the leg by the arrow was not that significant, although it was bad. The injury to his shoulder and his upper arm was life-threatening, and he almost died. And it was an injury that would follow him the rest of his life. He fought in that engagement until he passed out, very courageously. General Andrew Jackson took note of who he was, and from that point on in his life, he had a very strong relationship with Andrew Jackson, and he maintained that relationship and remained lifelong friends. After the battle, he was promoted to 2nd lieutenant. While still in the Army, he was appointed the sub-agent in charge of Indian affairs in the state of Tennessee. He served in that capacity for a couple of years. In 1818, a number of dramatic things happened with this fellow. He traveled to Washington with with representatives of the Cherokee Indians for the purpose of presenting their case. They met with President James C. Monroe and also Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. When he did this, he wore Indian dress. Secretary Calhoun reprimanded him for wearing Indian dress as an Army officer. He got discouraged. As soon as he got back, he resigned his commission in the Army and decided to study the law. Didn't go to law school, you studied the law with an existing law office. So in Nashville, Tennessee, he studied the law. He became a lawyer 6 months later when he took the bar exam, successfully passed it. He practiced law for a number of years in Tennessee in private practice and also held the office of Attorney General. And I think that office would translate today to the office of State's Attorney or Prosecuting Attorney. In 1823, he was elected to Congress from Tennessee through Andrew Jackson's political party, the Democratic Party at the time. In 1827, he was elected governor of Tennessee. He was now, 2 years later, in 1829, he was now 36 years old. He married a young 18-year-old bride named Eliza Allen in January of 1829. The marriage failed very quickly, and I think from what I've read, she had a former lover at age 18. So they didn't have television and computers then. She ran off home in April of 1829, and exactly 1 week after she left him, he resigned the office of governor in Tennessee. He became known as a big drunk. Eventually, he worked his way back to his Indian father, Chief Ulutika. And they, at this time, the Cherokee, were in the Arkansas-Oklahoma territory. For the next 2 years, he worked himself out of this state of depression, and he worked vigorously as he could for the Cherokee Indians, returning again to Washington on behalf of the Cherokee. He became an Indian. He became a Cherokee citizen. He took an Indian wife named Tiana Rogers. A side note, Tiana Rogers has a nephew several generations removed who is now famous as the beloved American humorist Will Rogers. While he was living with the Cherokee Indian, he developed malaria. He was treated with Indian medicine and overcame that. He did return to Washington in Indian attire again with the Cherokee, and at this time he met with President Andrew Jackson, his old friend. Andrew Jackson received him warmly, although Andrew Jackson did not have a good reputation for dealing with Indians during his administration. There are several dark spots, points of adversity in our friend's life, as you've seen. One of the darkest spots, also caused by alcohol, was in 1832 when he was in Washington. There was a Congressman, William Stanberry of Ohio, that spoke about our friend in Congress, and he made disparaging comments about him, accused him of being involved in fraudulent activity. Our friend immediately wrote the congressman asking for an explanation. None was forthcoming, so he hunted him down on Pennsylvania Avenue 10 days later and beat him severely with a cane, undoubtedly under the influence of alcohol at the time. The beating was so severe that charges were brought against him in the House of Representatives, the floor of Congress. During the trial in Congress, our friend had an attorney represent him. The attorney was Francis Scott Key, author of the National Anthem. The case was first presented in the House of Representatives on April 18th. Finally, on May 7th, our lawyer friend, not Francis Scott Key, pleaded his case directly to the House of Representatives. Historical accounts said he cleaned himself up and had gained restored confidence. His speech to Congress on behalf of himself was described as eloquent. As a result, he only received a slight reprimand from Congress. He was free to go, but he was once again dejected and depressed. The following August, he met with his old friend Andrew Jackson, now president. And President Jackson encouraged our friend to travel to Texas, the land of opportunity. As a matter of fact, President Jackson loaned or gave our friend the money to do so. He didn't have the sufficient funds to do so. Our friend went to Texas. In December of 1832, he crossed the Red River. That's not the one in North Dakota. It's the one in Texas, the northern border. He set up a law practice in Nacogdoches, which is in East Texas. And in the process, he got to know Stephen F. Austin. Let me tell you a few things about Stephen F. Austin. Stephen F. Austin is probably the single most important figure for the political development of the colonization of Texas. Stephen F. Austin worked closely with the Spanish government originally. In 1822, he went to Mexico City and worked with the Spanish regime. Later, Mexico became an empire of its own, was taken over by a military triumvirate, and then taken over by the military dictator, Don Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And through all these changes in administration, Austin kept his relations. He was the representative in the Texas territory. Austin had tremendous power as the representative there. He could grant title up to 4,600 acres to a married man who agreed to make improvements on the land within 2 years. He was the supreme judge of the land, and he exercised sole power to admit or exclude immigrants to the colony of Texas. Austin is generally known to have preferred a peaceable approach with Mexico. He thought the citizens of Texas were better off working through the government instead of fighting the government until the open hostilities broke out in late 1835. Our friend, the lawyer, did a lot of real estate work where their payment for his services was in real estate and not cash. So he was said to be land rich and cash poor. In 1833, there was a convention in Texas of delegates from across the territory. They met and talked about, kind of pursuing what Andrew Jackson had thought about, statehood for Texas. 3 delegates were sent from this convention to the headquarters of the Mexican government in Mexico City to request permission for the area to be separated off and become a state of the United States. Stephen F. Austin was one of the 3 delegates. They presented their request to Santa Anna, and he promptly put him in prison. Eventually, they let Austin out, and he returned. When the hostilities began, Stephen F. Austin was the initial commander-in-chief of the forces in Texas. He was the one that was the head person, and there was a tremendous loyalty to him. Austin soon recognized that he was not the best person to be commander-in-chief and urged our lawyer friend to take over based on his military experience. Our friend said no at first. Austin pressed, went to the troops, had volunteered to Austin, and with consent of the troops, he did take over as commander-in-chief. Austin, one other thing I want to say about Austin, his role was to go back to the United States and to gather money and munitions to support the revolution. But since he was setting the standards for immigration to the colony, his views were important. In 1830, Austin wrote to his brother-in-law on the issue of slavery, "I oppose a union with the United States without some guarantees. Amongst them, I should insist upon the perpetual exclusion of slavery from this country." He later wrote, in ruling upon the admission of slaves or Negroes to the territory in 1831, "Negroes can be brought here under indentures as servants, but not as slaves." The first shot of the Texas Revolution was fired in September of 1835, and I just happen to have a map of Texas back here. It wasn't erased. Texas before 1836. The first shot of the Texas Revolution was fired in Gonzales in September of 1835. The initial Declaration of Independence by the Texians, as they call themselves Texians, resulted in some initial successes with the Mexican troops. The Mexican troops were headquartered in San Antonio de Bexar. That county now today is known as Bexar County, B-E-X-A-R, the X is silent. And the troops were headquartered at the fortress known as the Alamo. Santa Anna's brother-in-law, Mexican General Coe, was in charge of the troops. The Texian soldiers had a skirmish at Gonzales, one at Goliad, and they were successful. At the end of 1835, they laid siege to the Alamo because they wanted to dislodge the Mexican troops altogether, get them out of the area. And so this lasted for a long time, 2 months, November and December, as a surrounding of the fortress and a continual attack on it. Eventually, by the end of December, the troops were dislodged and the Texans took control. The Colonel William Barrett Travis was in charge of the troops at the Alamo for the Texians, and other might have heard of his name. And together with him, supporting the revolution, were Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, names you might have heard of. They were defending the Alamo. They held on to the Alamo entirely through the months of January and February of 1836. In the meantime, our friend had been named Commander-in-Chief and Major General of the Army of Texas at 2 or 3 different locations and put in charge. In January of 1836, he traveled to Goliad. And while there at Goliad, he met with Jim Bowie. The word was out that Santa Anna was not pleased with what's going on, and so Santa Anna was in the process of bringing the entire Mexican army up to Texas to take care of things. And he was in the process of bringing 8,000 to 10,000 troops, which he did bring. When our lawyer friend learned this from Goliad, he gave Jim Bowie orders to return to the Alamo, to blow it up, and to leave the fortress, because the fortress was not defensible in its present situation with a small band of Texian soldiers there, soon to be surrounded by several thousand Mexican soldiers. Jim Bowie carried those orders to the Alamo, but unfortunately they weren't followed. Immediately after that was about the middle of January of 1836, this lawyer general was required to go to northern Texas because there were problems between the Cherokee Indians and the white settlers there, and he needed to broker a peace treaty. So he spent 2 months going to northern Texas to take care of that. In the meantime, we have a steady supply of Mexican troops from Mexico City and other parts of Mexico coming into Texas. And these troops began surrounding the Alamo. And so they were laying siege back on the Alamo. Along the way, there were 95 Texas soldiers protecting the southernmost outpost at San Patricio, and Santa Anna's men ran into these soldiers and engaged them. They had about 1,000 Mexicans against the 95, and killed all the Texas soldiers that were there. There was no surrender. You either were killed in battle, after the battle, or you escaped. And that was a policy that Santa Anna followed all the way through. There was another positioning of about 200 Texas volunteer soldiers at Refugio, about the same time they were moving toward the Alamo, and those soldiers were completely killed in battle or they escaped. Very few escaped. As the buildup around the Alamo was getting greater and greater, Colonel Travis sent a number of messages asking for help, and a lot of those messages are famous today in Texas history. The words, and if you read the messages, you'll see he writes, "I shall never surrender or retreat," and at the bottom of his messages asking for help, you find the words, "victory or death," and very well known down in Texas. At Goliad, left in power in January was Colonel Fannin, James Fannin, West Point officer. He tried to respond to one of the messages for help from Travis, but as he was on his way to the Alamo, he got word of the attack at San Patricio. There were 4 or 5 soldiers that escaped that, and there was another 1,000 soldiers coming in addition to the 5,000 that are already in the Alamo. So he decided he better not abandon the fortress of Goliad, and he stayed there. So in the end, no one was able to go to the aid of Fannin. Fannin had a fighting force of about 185 soldiers there. There's a few more. The basic force was 150. On March 1, a force of 32 volunteers came over from Gonzales, slipped through the Mexican soldier lines. There was about 6,000 there, and increased the numbers to a little bit over 180. And that was all the additional support he was going to get. On March 6, 1836, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Mexicans, now well entrenched around the Alamo, started their attack, and the Alamo fell quickly. Some 6,000 Mexicans. At that time, Santa Anna, after taking the Alamo initially, the 7 soldiers surrendered, and when the 7 soldiers presented themselves and asked for quarter for surrender, Santa Anna ordered them to be executed. There was a lady there, Susanna Dickinson, Mrs. Dickinson, her husband was a soldier. She had a 15-month-old baby. Santa Anna sent her back, together with written instructions that he was going to engage in exemplary punishment, and any soldier who's taken up arms against the Republic of Mexico would be executed. She carried that word on. In the meantime, our lawyer friend is back at the Constitutional Convention at Washington on the Brazos in Central Texas. It's not on the map. And that convention started on March 1. While he was there, he got word of the cries for help from Travis, and he immediately left to go to the Alamo in San Antonio. He arrived at Gonzales. That's kind of a central point here. He arrived at Gonzales on March 11, 5 days after the Alamo was taken, and it was complete chaos. Gonzales was supposed to be a point of mustering, where all the forces were going to meet and get organized and be able to take care of the Mexican soldiers. Our lawyer friend arrived in Gonzales on March 11th, and there was nothing but panic because word had fallen that the Alamo had been taken, everyone killed, and Mrs. Dickinson was there telling her story about what she had seen. He had to make decisions very quickly on March 11th. And the decision he made, which was unpopular with many, was that he had to retreat. He had less than 400 volunteer soldiers at Gonzales, many of them never trained, not with proper weapons. He retreated from the city at 11 o'clock that night, and so the retreat was immediately on. His only strategy, he thought, was to regroup, retreat, try to find time to train the soldiers, try to find some kind of strategic vantage point over the Mexicans. In the meantime, he sent couriers to Fannin down in Goliad. And the couriers brought Fannin a message, which I'll read here shortly, begging Fannin to also retreat and regroup with him. Historians are not kind to Colonel Fannin. The recorded reports, the historians of Fannin, is that he was not interested in taking orders from anybody else. He wanted to win the war by himself, and he had too much ambition. On March 11th, there in Gonzales, he sent a message to Fannin, which I'll read, together with written military orders. The message, I'm not going to read all of it, just parts of it. To Colonel Fannin, commanding at Goliad, Sir, on my arrival here this afternoon, the following intelligence was received through a Mexican. That the Alamo was attacked on Sunday morning at the dawn of day. Colonel Travis had only 150 effective men out of his entire force of 187. After the fort was carried, 7 men surrendered and called for Santa Anna and for quarter. They were murdered by his order. Colonel Boye was sick in bed and was also murdered. The bodies of the Americans were burned after the massacre. Alternate layers of wood and bodies were laid together and set on fire. And here's the order, Army order. To Colonel J.W. Fannin, commanding at Goliad, Sir, you will as soon as practicable, on receipt of this order, fall back upon Guadalupe Victoria with your command and with such artillery as can be brought with expedition. The remainder will be sunk in the river. You will take the necessary measures for the defense of Victoria and forward 1/3 of your effective men to this point. Remain in command until further orders. Every facility is to be afforded to women and children who may be desirous of leaving that place. Previous to abandoning Goliad, you shall take the necessary measures to blow up that fortress and do so before leaving its vicinity. The immediate advance of the enemy may be constantly expected, as well as the rise of water. Prompt movements are thereby highly important. I didn't draw the rivers on here, but there's rivers in Texas too. It was a rainy season, is in April, or March and April, so that was a problem. The couriers from the general waited for Fannin's reply. He wasn't going to reply, so finally one of the couriers said, "What do we say?" And Fannin said, "No, tell him that I will not give up the fort." So he refused to give up the fort. Eventually, a couple weeks later, the Goliad massacre occurs almost 3 weeks after the massacre at the fighting at the Alamo, the Saturday before Palm Sunday, toward the end of March. Colonel Fannin soon found himself surrounded by thousands of Mexican troops, and when Santa Anna offered a peaceable surrender, he jumped at the chance. An actual treaty of surrender was prepared and signed by both parties. The treaty assured the soldiers that they would be allowed to surrender their arms, leave Mexico, and return peaceably to the United States. I have an account I want to read from one of the soldiers who was there. It's a very lucky fellow named Lieutenant Harrison. I can't read all of it. I'd love to. Once you start reading it, you don't want to stop. But he was able to escape. And as soon as he escaped, he was free for about 5 hours until he was captured by some other Mexicans who took him down to slave service in Mexico in the mines there. Eventually he left there and he was able to come back and tell this story. There were 4 or 5 soldiers who escaped this. This is Lieutenant Harrison's report that was published after all of these business in the mid-1800s. I do not know the precise number of my companions, but I think there were in the neighborhood of 400. We had been completely surrounded and hard-pressed at Goliad for some days, during which time we could get no tidings of any reinforcement being at hand. When one morning, to our surprise, we saw the bearer of a flag of truce approaching, and all was anxious to know the cause, some anticipating one thing and some another. At length it was made known that Santa Anna wished to hold a parley with our commander, for the purpose of effecting a peace and saving further bloodshed. This to us, who were completely surrounded by an enemy of 10 times our number and who could scarce hope for anything short of eventually being cut to pieces, proved, as will readily be imagined, most joyful tidings. The interview desired was readily granted, and during which a proposition was made by Santa Anna himself to the effect that if our gallant little army would surrender ourselves prisoners to the Mexicans, we should have good treatment and be shipped back to the United States, most of my companions as well as myself being from there, at the expense of the Mexican government. This, to soldiers in our condition, many of us thousands of miles from home, was joyful news, and seemed a liberal offer, so much so that after slight consultation among the superior officers, it was accepted, and the articles of capitulation signed, those on the part of the Mexicans by Santa Anna himself. Never did I experience more joy than at the prospect of once more returning to my native land, and this I could perceive also in the faces of my companions, for we had all endured uncommon hardships during the preceding winter, many of us being almost naked and sometimes entirely destitute of food. One article of the treaty that we should yield up our arms was, and accordingly so, as soon as the surrender was made, we were left entirely at the mercy of our foes. The night following our surrender passed off quietly, and contrary to the expectation of some, who at first apprehended treachery, the Mexicans treated us with great care and kindness, and every suspicion was lulled to rest. The morning following our surrender, we were all marched out together for the purposes stated of making provision for and embarking us on our homeward voyage. Never during my whole campaign had I seen so many really happy faces among my companions. Some sung, some danced, some smiled as it were to themselves, but each appeared in his own peculiar way uncommonly exhilarated. The course which we took led to a large open plain or prairie, some 2 or 3 miles distant from our encampment, whither we were conducted by our party of armed Mexicans, and where we arrived in something less than an hour. Ere we reached the plain, we were somewhat startled and surprised, many of us by seeing large bodies of armed Mexican soldiers and guerrillas moving about as if stationing themselves on the outskirts of an imagined circle. This alarmed our officers, who instantly demanded of our conductors the meaning, and were answered, "Oh, it was only a military parade gotten up by order of Santa Anna for the purpose of making a display and showing off his knowledge of military tactics, owing that we would be likely to give descriptions of it in the public prints when we reached the United States." This was all natural enough, for Santa Anna was known to be a vain man. As we marched upon the ground selected for our destruction, we again perceived with considerable alarm that the soldiers on the outskirts of what appeared a large circle gradually marched in toward the center, thereby narrowing it and making their columns more dense as they approached. We now began to see, but at last too late, that something terrible was about to follow, for now there was no longer any need of caution on the part of the dastardly cutthroat Mexicans. A few moments of awful surprise and the bloody signal was given, and then a scene of horror, God, I may never witness it again. From all sides, with a simultaneous yell of horrible ferocity, more like the supposed yell of hell's demons than earthly inhabitants, they, armed to the teeth, mounted and oil foot, rushed in upon us, weak, defenseless beings, and inhuman, ferocious butchery of the innocent victims was begun. At first, so horror-stricken and taken by surprise was that I stood perfectly still, unable, I believe, for some minutes to have moved, even had I seen the blow about to fall, which was to launch me into eternity. Then I started, and with every sense seemed more acute for its previous paralyzation. Oh, horror of horrors, what an awful work was going on around me. My countrymen, my companions, were falling by tens, even by hundreds, beneath the red, reeking blades of their treacherous foes, while shrieks, groans, and the most horrible yells and curses resounded on every hand. At this moment of carnage, I saw a mounted Mexican rushing toward me with a drawn saber to one hand and a pistol in the other, and I'm going to have to stop. It's an incredible story about how he was able to defeat the Mexican on the soldier and grab his horse and ride away. There were 4 or 5 others that the Mexicans left for dead, and then under cover of nightfall they were able to escape to report the events at Goliad. In the meantime, our friend had left Gonzales with everybody he had, which was less than 400. He was hoping to meet up with Fannon's force of 400 at Victoria. That wasn't going to happen, so the force of 400 didn't develop. He had very little that he could do. What he did for the next month and 10 days involved not only his military training under Andrew Jackson, but much of his Indian training. Much of the strategy that he employed from that point on was strategy he learned with the Cherokee Indians. He retreated and constantly moved backward. He was criticized heavily by that, for doing that. Many of the soldiers, not knowing the situation, wanted immediate revenge, wanted to immediately attack the Mexicans in an effort that would be futile. He started out with less than 400. This process is famous in Texas. It's called the Runaway Scrape. It lasted for a month and 10 days, starting at Gonzales and ending up over in the plains of San Jacinto. During the time of this movement backwards, his numbers would swell as high as 1,400, but then people would leave because they were frustrated that they didn't know what was going on. And so volunteer army, no uniforms, would come in 2s and 3s and 20s, and then they would get frustrated and leave. At one point, one of the reports I read over the weekend, there was a group of 400 volunteers that left at one time when they went to the general and asked him, "What are we going to do now?" and he refused to tell them. Many of those did return before it was over. According to the Indian strategy, he was drawing out the supply lines of his opponent, bringing his opponent from as far away from his home base as possible, bringing him in to his own territory. Also, Santa Anna, after his victory here at the Goliad, which was preceded by his victory at the Alamo, he made a decision that I'm sure he lived to regret, and that was he divided his forces. He divided his 8,000 to 10,000 troops into 3 groups, sent 2 of them to scour the northern part of Texas. He knew that there was a runaway group of militia, the only one left, and he himself took the biggest and the strongest forces that he had to pursue that group, but he divided his numbers. Our friend was called Yellow, Chicken, and Coward repeatedly by many. At one point in time, the Texas Republic had a new president named David Burnett, and he wrote him a very sarcastic note asking him to turn around and fight, quit running away. He sent the note to our general friend by way of the Secretary of War, Thomas Rusk. When Thomas Rusk arrived at the scene, saw the situation, and the general confided in him. He's the only one that he told his real battle plan to. He approved of the battle plan, and no more complaints were made to the general from the administration of the Texas Republic. The Mexicans were cocky and self-assured. They perceived our general's steady and continuous retreat as a sign of weakness, that they were afraid to fight. And as he kept going back from Gonzales to the east, he was eventually going to run into the Gulf of Mexico. And the Texians were headed, some thought, to the steamships that came into Galveston to get on board a ship and to flee, not to be killed by the Mexican soldiers. And so many perceived his runaway retreat as fleeing to the Gulf of Mexico to sail away. Also, we have eventually a temporary capital, Harrisburg, set up here. Some thought he was going to head to Harrisburg and perhaps try to save the capital. The capital ended up not being saved, but that was one of the thoughts of what our general was going to do. The Sabine River is the border between the Texas area and the Louisiana Territory. Over in the Louisiana Territory, on the Louisiana side of the Sabine River, was General Pendleton Gaines, United States Army, and he had a small force of troops there. And so there was speculation that our friend was going to hook up with General Gaines and then try to stand the battle against Santa Anna. Nobody knew, he wouldn't even tell the troops, but as he got closer and closer to the Gulf of Mexico, a decision was going to be forced. He was able to stop for 10 days at one point to train some of the troops at one location, to repair the weapons. He developed a scouting and spy service. There were all kinds of people riding around on horseback. As a matter of fact, one of the units he had with him, a unit of 19 or 20, were Spanish settlers that were fighting Santa Anna. And so the ability of spies to go back and forth was pretty prevalent. As Santa Anna and his group followed to this point, they were cocky and they also liked to destroy things along the way. And so as our friend approached, the San Jacinto River empties into the Galveston Bay, and Galveston Bay empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is some 50 or 60 miles from the Gulf itself, but this all starts back around here. As our friend approached that location, Santa Anna couldn't help but divide his forces now and take about half of them up to Harrisburg. So on April 17th, Santa Anna took some troops and plundered Harrisburg, took the supplies, and burned the capital. Our friend had to decide what he was going to do. Santa Anna left his forces encamped right at the point. Another thing to show you here. Get that turned on. Left his forces camped right at the location where the San Jacinto River gets ready to dump into the bay, Galveston Bay. And as he approached that area, our friend finally found a point of strategy and was able to settle his forces down in a location close to the Mexican forces. And at the time he settled his forces in, the Mexican forces that were there were only around 700 or 800, although there were 4,000 Mexican troops in the general area, but because Santa Anna had gone off to plunder Harrisburg. The San Jacinto River is running over here along this side, which is basically the east side of this area. Another river-like thing, they call it a bayou in Texas, Buffalo Bayou. It's a river and the streams were swollen because of the spring rains is there. The Mexicans had encamped on the high ground. This was the highest part of the area, and there was timber all around that. But as soon as you got south and west of there, it was swamp, and it was you couldn't travel through that. Basically, this whole area, although quite large during this raining season, was like a giant island. Access to this area was gained through a bridge known as Vince's Bridge, and it's located some 6 miles east or west, I'm sorry, 6 miles west of this plain where the encampment was. Now our general, you can see it where it says the ferry, our general brought most of his troops across by ferry. The cavalry could of course go down and cross the bridge by an old boat, and the ferry was actually just the floor of a house, one of the few houses that had a wood floor at the time. And they used it as a ferry, and so he was sneaking his troops into the northeast corner of this plains and was setting up their encampment. Although they were downhill from the Mexicans, they were protected by brush and also by the rise in the terrain, so they couldn't really clearly be seen. The actual encampments were only 3/4 of a mile apart, so they're very close together. The Mexicans basically were returning from Harrisburg on April 19th and returning to their main campsite. On April 20th, a large group of Mexicans were coming back, having crossed the bridge at Vince's Bridge, and having seen the Texians, there was a skirmish that they entered into. Almost turned into a full-scale engagement, but the Texians put up a fight, showed the strength, and then withdrew without getting into a full-scale engagement. The Texian colonel that led that engagement was Colonel Sherman, and we lost several horses in that fight, and at least one Texian was killed, maybe two. 2 were severely wounded. During that fight, there was a private from Georgia named Maribel Lamar, and he was on the cavalry, and he was noted for his bravery by everyone that was involved. I don't know what he did, but the reports are what he did was tremendous in conducting himself in that engagement on April 20th. That our general friend promoted him to colonel, and he was the next day in charge of the cavalry that would engage in the Battle of San Jacinto. Maribel Lamar. You know, and I looked at these pictures. You can get pictures of these old guys, and there's a striking resemblance between Maribel Lamar and Eric Picard. And yet, the names rhyme, Picard and Lamar, and it's incredible. I'll have to give you that on email. But anyway, that's on April 20th. The Mexicans are reinforcing themselves by crossing this bridge. After the engagement, spirits were high. The Texians wanted to fight. When our general friend crossed the bayou and the river, he only had an effective fighting force of 700. He left 248 men on the other side because they were sick and unable to fight. So his total effective fighting force was around 700. On April 20th, and also very early on April 21st, Mexican General Coe also joined Santa Anna, and the Mexican troops at this point had grown to 1,300. So there are 1,300 Mexicans employed on the high ground on the plains of San Jacinto. The Texians wanted to fight. The fever was there. Things were very tense. The morning of April 21st came. Most of the time during the night, the Mexicans were working, building this thing called breastworks. These are barricades that they're breast high so they could stand there and fire their rifles at the enemy. They were expecting an attack at dawn. At this day and time, virtually every battle that was fought at dawn, because the soldiers would position themselves under the dark sky in a strategic location. And then when dawn arose, the battle would begin. And that was the way battles were fought in the 1800s and in the morning. That's what happened at the other locations. Even the initial engagement down at Goliad before the surrender was a dawn battle. The attack of the Alamo was a dawn battle. Dawn came and there was no attack. The Texians were excited because the general had told them there would be a fight, but it didn't come at dawn. And they waited, they waited, and they waited. They were very impatient. One of the reports I read by a private was there said that early morning on the April 21, a raven flew from the Texas side of the camp to the Mexican side of the camp, and the general interpreted that as a good omen, coming from his Indian name. Shortly before 1 o'clock, our general friend sent a team of scouts down to Vince's Bridge to destroy it. He gave the orders, and so it was 6 miles away. A team of 2 or 3 scouts were dispatched. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the general deployed his troops. He sent Sherman with his troops behind these trees over here to the far left flank. The other troops were going to have to cross the plain uphill. I read a Mexican officer's report. He stood up on a munitions box to see what was coming at him, and he said it was a rank of 1. The troops could barely touch each other and walk across the field. That's how thin the line was. 1 rank of troops across the plain. Lamar, he sent over here to the west with the cavalry. At this point, the cavalry was 61 units, 61 horses. Now, these troops were deployed at 3:30 in the afternoon. The Battle of San Jacinto began at 4 o'clock. Let me open up this one. Because what I'm doing now is switching this plat to a north-south direction. And our general had learned with the Indians to take advantage of the forces of nature. And he positioned himself in this battle so that the vast majority of his attacking force would be protected by the blazing Texas sun staring into the eyes of the enemy. The strongest part of his force, Lamar's cavalry, would be hitting from due west. All the soldiers crossing the plain were going to come in from the northwest with the Texas sun looking in the eyes of the enemy. The only part of his force that wasn't going to be protected by the sun was Sherman, and they were deployed behind the trees, so they were protected by the timber. The Battle of San Jacinto started at 4 o'clock. It lasted 18 minutes. The Texans lost, were killed 6 to 9 soldiers, depending on which historian you read. 12 to 30 Texan soldiers were wounded, including the general. 650 Mexican soldiers were killed. 208 were wounded. 730 Mexican soldiers were taken prisoner in the Battle of San Jacinto, which lasted 18 minutes. Many less Mexican soldiers could have been killed if they'd stopped the killing earlier, but they were unable to do so, even though the officers and the general tried to do so. Many more Mexican soldiers would have been killed had not the general and his officers pleaded with the soldiers to stop the killing. Preceding the engagement, the general, I have a report here from one of the foot soldiers in the battle. Turn the lights back on. Creed Taylor, and it's quite long, but here's what the general and his officers gave inspirational speeches to the soldiers. Here's what the general said. "Remember, my boys, you are fighting for Texas and for your loved ones, to avenge the human butchery of your friends and comrades at the Alamo and Goliad. We must win or die. Let us fight fast and hard." Just before the troops engaged, the scouting force that destroyed Vince's Bridge had returned, and as they were marching across the field, they shouted out to the troops, "Vince's Bridge is gone. There is no escape." As the soldiers went in, they cried out, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." It's widely known in Texas today that many Mexicans now, who were about ready to get killed, and some were saved, went running around saying, "Me no Alamo, me no Goliad," meaning I wasn't there. I wasn't one of the ones that participated in that. Santa Anna himself was not captured at that time. He ran away. They all ran away. He ran away and he escaped, but there was no place to go because they burned the bridge. He tried to go to the bridge. The following day, they sent scouts out to flush out those that had run away and were hiding in the brushes. They brought him in, and as one of the additional prisoners were brought in wearing a corporal's uniform, it was Santa Anna. The Mexican soldiers in camp started saying, "El Presidente, El General." And so they let the Texians know that that was the Santa Anna himself. Our general friend was shot in the ankle, and the entire day on the 22nd, he was laying against a tree flat on his back. They brought Santa Anna to him, and he propped himself up on the tree to preside over things. There was an immediate cry for Santa Anna's execution. There was a large portion of this volunteer army that wanted him executed immediately for what he had done at the Goliad and the Alamo. Once again, our general friend made an unpopular decision. He did not execute Santa Anna. Instead, he ordered that pen and paper be brought to Santa Anna, And at that time, Santa Anna entered the orders that our general told him to enter. And that was to command the withdrawal of all the remaining Mexican troops in Texas, and also to surrender the entire territory north of the Rio Grande River. Now, if you ever look at what the original Spanish claim was, it was tremendous. And as a result of the Battle of San Jacinto, about 40% of the territory originally claimed by Spain was surrendered to the Anglo settlers. This included not only all of Texas, parts of Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, even parts of Wyoming were surrendered at this time by Santa Anna. That ended the revolution. It also helped fulfill what's been described in history as manifest destiny. That is, the United States was destined to be bordered by both oceans at the time the country was completed expanding. How many people know who the general is? Raise your hand high if you know. About a third, right? Well, I wouldn't have known. Who is it? Houston. Sam Houston, that's right, Sam Houston. Let me read a brief report from this foot soldier, Creed Taylor. This isn't very long. Once the order to charge was given and the furious fight began, all semblance of order had ceased. The respective commanders were simply unable to direct or control their men. Even the commander-in-chief himself was virtually as a private. Although wounded early in the action, a ball shattering his ankle and penetrating his horse, General Houston displayed unusual bravery and calmness throughout as he rode here and there, encouraging the men and endeavoring to direct operations. His wounded horse, covered with foam and blood, finally fell, but the general quickly remounted another and spurred forward into the thick of the fray, shouting, "Come on, my brave fellows, your general leads you." Houston's enemies accused him of cowardice at San Jacinto, that he was unduly excited, that he became a hero by accident. I observed the general on the field several times during the fight, and I can say truthfully that in every instance and in every way he appeared cool and collected. I can never forget his magnificent and commanding appearance as he dashed from point to point over the field. He certainly looked and acted every inch a military chieftain. They used every means to stop the killing of the panic-stricken and fleeing Mexicans, but it was some time before the men gave any heed to their commanders. When the firing did cease, our boys were wild with delight. General Houston rode over the field with blood dripping from his stirrup, tried to establish order by urging the men to get into line and fall back to camp, but he only met with good-natured raillery, whereupon the general is said to have exclaimed, "Boys, I like your courage, but damn your manners." He did sail away from Galveston to New Orleans in early May. Surgeons removed 20 pieces of bone from the wounded area in his ankle, and he was even more crippled for the rest of his life. He returned to Texas. The first president of Texas went through an election, and he was elected the first president. He received, there were 3 people running, he received 5,119 votes. The second place candidate got 743 votes. The third place candidate was Stephen F. Austin, receiving 587 votes. Houston immediately reached out to his political opponent, Stephen F. Austin, and asked him to be Secretary of State, which he agreed to do. Maribel Lamar was elected the first vice president of the Republic of Texas and became the second president of the Republic of Texas. Houston returned to be president of Texas again. When Texas became a state, he was elected to serve as one of its first senators in Washington, and he served as senator from 1846 to 1859, some 13 years. He was defeated in some controversy between the North and the South. He ran for governor, was elected governor, took the office of governor in Texas in 1859. At that time, Texas had a population of 600,000. He died in 1863, and before he died, he was ultimately going to be extremely unpopular with the vast majority of the people of Texas once again. He was again to be called the coward. Following a popular vote in the state of Texas, and following a push from everybody else who was in a leadership position in the state of Texas, Texas seceded from the Union. Houston, as governor, refused to take an oath of allegiance to the Confederate States. He was opposed to a division of the North. He remained true to his alliance with Andrew Jackson and with the United States. Even though Texas had formally seceded from the Union, Houston's opposition single-handedly stopped Texas from actively engaging in the Civil War. Estimates by historians today are that thousands of lives were saved because of that. His Indian wife had died. He did get a divorce from Eliza Allen, the 18-year-old. In 1840, he met Margaret Lee of Alabama, and they were married and they had 8 children. and it's their descendants that I've come to know. Points you might remember from this. I appreciate you staying long and having so many of you here in such great numbers. As you practice law, you don't have to write this down. You can feel free. You may run across a lawyer who is laid back, who may even seem like a coward at times. I urge you not to judge too hastily. For wisdom and knowing how and when to press upon your opposition are valuable traits not easily acquired. These traits can overcome overwhelming odds. For those of you who go out and start up a new law practice on your own and you run into troubles, just think it could be worse. You could be in Nacogdoches, Texas in 1833. Obviously, the right or the best decision may not be the popular decision. Beware of lawyers who limp or use a cane. I've come to know about, that's true. When you think someone is acting cowardly, think again. Here's one of my favorites. Just because you have problems or dark times in your life, which everyone does, it doesn't mean that you can't rise above the adversity to achieve some degree of success. Pure revenge is rarely, probably never, an effective strategy. Final point. One does not have to experience great losses or resources to have a great victory. Wisdom, timing, and the forces of nature are all important and can be utilized to your advantage. I'm done. Thank you.
Oh, my name is Richard Galliano, and I'm a historian, and I've been to all these places mentioned by the professor, and it was very well presented and very excellently researched, and I appreciate it. I thought I was back in Texas. Thank you.
As a Texan, a soldier, and a future lawyer, I appreciate Professor Barron's lecture. My home is right here, Kingsville, Texas. Close down to the southern tip of Texas, full of history, a lot of history for the state of Texas, and I appreciate someone who's come up to South Dakota and shows everybody up here in the north exactly what it is to be a Texan.
I thought it was a very informative, very compelling story that he told, something I certainly would never have known of, and it was just an amazing story. He has an eloquent way of saying it, and I was very impressed. It's kind of a neat to hear about somebody that can overcome adversity and achieve such greatness.
I thought that the presentation was an excellent presentation. I learned a lot. I had heard of the Sam Houston before, but I forgot all the things that he had done, and I thought that it was excellent.
It was a great story, well told, and we certainly need some input about overcoming adversity a week before finals, so thank you. Sorry.
I thought that Professor Barron's storytelling technique was excellent. As a storyteller myself, I could visualize being in Texas at the Alamo with the fighting forces, and I appreciate Professor Barron telling that story today.
Being Professor Barron's daughter, I have heard the story before, but I think each and every time it gets better and better, and this was definitely the best thus far with the map and everything. That really helped. Great storytelling, everything was excellent, and on behalf of my friend Kim, who was also here, she would like to say she thoroughly enjoyed the story. She had to leave to go to work, so she couldn't speak. And Carissa, my other friend, who is not going to be speaking to the camera for one reason or another, also enjoyed the story. So, thanks.